As soon as I finished my last video about shooting outdoors without ND filters, I realized that there was one pretty big piece of advice that I left out. If you haven't seen that video yet, the link is up here. This is a tip that relates to shutter speed, and what we're gonna look at here is the amount of motion blur you get when subjects are moving from side to side versus towards or away from you.
Let's get rockin'!
So first take a look at this shot where my dad is moving his hand from side to side. And in this shot, I am using an ND filter and the shutter speed is set to double the frame rate the way it's supposed to. If we freeze frame this shot, we see there's a lot of motion blur going on, which is exactly what you want. Now let's look at a shot where everything is the exact same, except I am not using an ND filter and the shutter speed is set to 800 instead of double the frame rate. When we freeze this shot, we'll see that there's basically no motion blur at all, which is why it's so hard on the eyes, because your eyes usually perceive things that are moving like that with a little bit of motion blur. Take a look at the first shot and the second shot side by side for reference. You probably were already aware of the whole motion blur thing. If you're watching this video, you probably know a little bit about why people use ND filters, but check out what I'm gonna show you right now. This is where things start to get a little interesting. In this first shot, I am using an ND filter and I'm using the correct shutter speed. My dad is moving his hand towards and away from the lens. Even though his hand is moving relatively fast and we're at the correct shutter speed, unlike the shot where his hand was moving side to side, this time there isn't that much motion blur. Now we're gonna look at that same forward and backwards motion again, except this time we're not using an ND filter and the shutter speed is once again at 800. While this shot is a little bit harder on the eyes than the first one that was moving towards and away from the lens, when we freeze the image, you'll notice that there isn't that much less motion blur than on the shot where the shutter speed was set correctly. Take a look at the two shots of the hand moving forward and backward side by side for reference. If you're wondering why my dad's pointer finger is so short, it's because when he was 2 years old, he went ahead and chopped it off in a meat grinder. So, good going, Dad. You can do this test that I did with my camera right now in real life. If you take your hand and you do this, you are going to notice a lot more blur than when you do this. If you know that your eyes don't perceive that much blur when objects are moving forward and away from you, then if you're in a situation where you have to set your shutter speed very high, where you're not going to have much motion blur, it's probably best to have your subject move forward and backwards, because your eyes aren't used to seeing blur in those types of situations anyways. Also, another thing you may want to think about is that you probably shouldn't have your camera moving very much, because if you notice, if you move your head like this, things will look blurry, and because the viewer is experiencing things through your lens, the camera movement really kind of resembles a head turn, so you don't want to move it too much if you're shooting at shutter speeds that are way higher than you want them to be. If you thought this was useful, do me a favor and go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see things similar to this in the future. I'm really just trying to help you guys here. I mean, I'm trying to save your eyes, because the only thing that actually hurts more than footage without any motion blur is probably sticking your finger in a meat grinder.